Year 7, Part 1. Pat and Ray felt in the months of that following winter that they needed every ounce of philosophy and diplomacy that they possessed. The first weeks were very hard. At times, adjustment seemed almost impossible. May's quick temper increased the difficulty. Some of the scenes she made always remained in Pat's memory, like degrading, vulgar things. Yet her spasms of rage were not so bad, the girls thought, as her little smiles and innuendos about everything. "I think I have some rights, Shirley," she would say to Sid, with a toss of her sleek head. "It's hard to do anything with somebody watching and criticizing all the time, isn't it now, honey boy?" And Sid would look at Pat with defiant and yet appealing eyes that nearly broke her heart. When May could not get her way, she sulked and went round for a day or two, with a puss on her mouth, according to Judy. Then, finding that nobody paid any attention to her sulks, she would become amiable again. Pat set her teeth and kept her head. "I won't have quarrels at Silverbush," she said. "Whatever she does or says, I won't quarrel with her. And even when May cries passionately, 'You've always tried to make trouble between me and Sid,' Pat would always smile and say, 'Come, May, be reasonable. We are not children now, you know.' Then go up to her room and writhe in secret over the torment and ugliness of it all." In the long run, May succumbed to the inevitable. Compromises were made on both sides, and life settled once more into outward calmness at Silverbush. One thing nobody could deny was that May was a worker, and fortunately she liked outside work better than inside. She took over the care of milk and poultry, Judy making a virtue out of necessity in yielding it to her and never denying that the separator was thoroughly cleaned. "May," Mrs. Binney said superfluously. "May," Mrs. Binney said superfluously, "is not a soulless society woman. I brought all my gals up to work." To be sure, May made a frightful racket in everything she did, and at Silverbush, where household ritual had always been performed without noise, this was something of a domestic crime. Pat, suffering too much to be just, told Ray that May made more fuss in 10 minutes than anyone else could make in a year. Judy and May had one battle royale as to who was to scrub the kitchen. Judy won. May never attempted to usurp Judy's kitchen privileges again. Pat found she could get used to being unhappy, and then that she could even be happy again, between the spasms of unhappiness. Of course, there were changes everywhere. Little irritating changes, which were perhaps harder to bear than some greater dislocation. For one thing, May's friends gave her a shower, after which Silverbush was cluttered up with gimcracks. Pat's especial hatred was a dreadful onyx-topped table. May put it in the hall under the heirloom mirror. It was a desecration. And May's new gay cushions, which made everything else seem faded, were scattered everywhere. But May did not get her own way when it came to moving furniture about. She learned that things were to be left as they were, and that a large engraving of Landseer's stag, framed in crimson plush and gilt a foot wide, was not going to be hung in the dining room. May, after a scene, carried it off to her own room, where nobody interfered with her arrangements. "I suppose your ladyship doesn't object to that," she remarked to Pat. "Of course you can do as you like in your own room," said Pat wearily. Would this petty bickering go on forever? And that very afternoon, May had broken the old Bristol ware vase by stuffing a huge bouquet of mums into it. Of course it was cracked. Always had been cracked. May said she didn't hold with having cracked things around. She had her own room repapered, blue roses on a bright pink ground. "So cheerful," Mrs. Binney said admiringly. "That gray paper in what they call the Pote's room gives me the willies, May dearie." May brought her dog with her, an animal known by the time-tested name of Rover. He killed the chickens, dug up Pat's bulbs, chewed the clothes on the line. Tillytuck had a pitched battle with May because his best shirt was mangled, and chased the cats in his spare time. Eventually, Just Dog gave him a drubbing which chastened him, and Ray, in May's absences, used to spank him so soundly with a stiff folded newspaper that he learned manners after a sort. There were even times when Pat was afraid she was learning to like him. It was hard for Pat not to like a dog if he had any decency at all. As Pat had foreseen, Silverbush was overrun with the Binney tribe. May's brothers flicked cigarette ashes all over the house. Her sisters and cousins came in what Judy called droves, filling the house with shrieks, and listened behind doors. Judy caught them at it. And they were always more or less offended, no matter how they were treated. If you were nice to them, you were patronizing them. If you left them alone, you were snubbing them. Olive would bring her whole family. Olive did not believe in punishing children. "They're going to enjoy their childhood," she said. Perhaps they enjoyed it, but nobody else did. They were what Judy called holy terrors. Judy found a dirty gray velvet elephant in her soup pot one day. Olive's 6-year-old had slipped it in for fun. Mrs. Binney came over frequently and spent the afternoon in Judy's kitchen, proclaiming to the world that as far as she was concerned, all was peace and goodwill. She rocked fiercely on the golden oak rocker May had introduced into the kitchen. Rather fortunately, Judy thought, for certainly no Silverbush chair could be counted on to bear up under the strain of Mrs. Binney's 233 pounds. "No, 236, Ma," May would argue. "I guess I know my own weight, child," Mrs. Binney would retort breezily, "and I ain't ashamed of it. Why don't you diet? My sister Josephine keeps telling me. Not for mine, I tell her. I'm contented to be as God made me." Oh, I do be thinking God had precious little to do with it," said Judy to Tillytuck. Mrs. Binney had a little button nose and yellowish white hair screwed up in a tight knot on the crown of her head. Gossip was her mother tongue, and grammar was her servant, not her master. Also, her infernal organs gave her a good deal of trouble. Pat used to wonder how Sid could bear to look at her and think that May would be like her when she was 60. "I'd like to give that hair of hers a bluing rinse," Ray would whisper maliciously to Pat when Mrs. Binney was laying down the law about something and nodding her head until a hairpin invariably slipped out. Mrs. Binney, unlike May, couldn't abide cats. They gave her asthma, and, as May said, she started gasping if a cat was parked within a mile of her. So when Mrs. Binney came, out went the cats. Even Boldenbad was no exception. Boldenbad, however, did not hold with self-pity, and made himself at home in Tillytuck's granary. "But I'd like to have seen you try it on, Gentleman Tom," Judy used to think malevolently. Generally, one or more of them rampageous Binney girls came with her, and they and May talked and argued without cessation. The Binneys were a family with no idea of reticence. Everybody told everything to everybody else. Talking it over, they called it. None of them could ever understand why everything that was thought about couldn't be talked about. They had no comprehension whatever of people who did not think at the tops of their voices and empty out their feelings to the dregs. There were times when the unceasing clack of their tongues drove Tillytuck to the granary, even on the coldest winter afternoons, for escape, and Pat longed despairingly for the beautiful old silences. There was at least one consolation for Pat and Ray. They still had their evenings undisturbed. May thought it quite awful to sit in the kitchen with the servants. Generally, she carried Sid off to a dance or show, and when they were home they had company of their own in their little parlor, which had been tacitly handed over to May, and which she called the living room, much to Judy's amusement. "Ho, ho, we've only got one living room at Silverbush, and that's me kitchen," she would remark to Tillytuck with a wink. "There do be more living down here than in all the other rooms put together." "You've said a mouthful," said Tillytuck, just as he had said it to Lady Medchester. So Pat and Ray and Judy and Tillytuck foregathered as of old in the kitchen of evenings and forgot for a few hours the shadow that was over Silverbush. They always had some special little jamboree to take the taste of some particularly hard day out of their mouths, as, for instance, the one on which Pat found May prying into her bureau drawers, or the one when May, who had a trick of acting hostess, assured a fastidious visiting clergyman who had declined a second helping that there was plenty more in the kitchen. They could even laugh over Mrs. Binney's malapropisms. It was so delicious when she asked Ray gravely whether phobias were annuals or perennials. To be sure, neither Judy nor Tillytuck was very sure where the point of the joke was, but it was heartening to see the girls laughing again as of old. Those evenings were almost the only time it was safe to laugh. If May heard laughter, she took it into her head that they were laughing at her, and sulked. Once in a while, when May had gone for one of her frequent visits home, Sid would creep in too, for a little bit of the old-time fun, and one of Judy's little bites. Sid and Pat had had their hour of reconciliation long ere this. Pat couldn't endure to be out with Sid. But there were no more rambles and talks and plans together. May resented any such thing. She went with him now on his walks about the farm and expounded her ideas as to what changes should be made. She also aired her views to the whole family. A lot of trees should be cut down. There were entirely too many. It was messy, especially that aspen poplar by the steps, and the old part of the orchard ought to be cleaned out entirely. It was a sheer waste of good ground. She did not go so far as to suggest plowing up the graveyard, though she said it was horrid having a place like that so near the house and having to pass it every time you went to the barn or the hen house. When she went to either of these places after dark, she averred it made her flesh creep. "If I were you," she would remark airily to Pat, "I'd make a few changes round here. A front porch is so out of date. And there really should be a wall or two knocked out. The poet's room and our room together would just make one real nice size room. You don't need 2 spare rooms any more than a frog needs trousers." "Silverbush suits us as it is," said Pat stiffly. "Don't get so excited, child," said May provokingly, and how provoking May could be. "I was only making a suggestion. Surely you needn't throw a fit over that." She would do nothing but patch and change and tear up if she could have her way here, Pat told Ray viciously. Oh, just like her old granddad," said Judy. "He did be having a mania for tearing down and rebuilding. Anything for a change was his motto." "Judy, last night as I passed the little parlor, I heard May say to Sid, 'Anyway, you'll have Silverbush when your father dies.' Judy, she did. when your father dies." Judy chuckled. "It do be ill waiting for a dead man's shoes. Your dad is good for 20 years yet at the least, but it's like a Benny to be saying that same."